This idea that's sort of captured into phrase that the future will not be like the past. That is that, and scientists use words like stationarity. That is, there is no average around which we can think about things fluctuating. That is, those long-term averages are going to change over time. We can't rely on what's happened in the past to be accurate in any way about what's going on in the future. These are actual data from Palm Beach. I think they're the airport station, long-term station going back well into the 30s. And one of the interesting things, and not all the stations show this in full disclosure, but it is interesting that one of the highest stations shows this really long-term decline in rainfall and an increase in evaporation. The sort of sum of those two is what you have available for use. So again, this is not, it's indicative of a really dynamic and changing situation where we can't rely on an average amount of water and an average amount of rainfall to think about the future. So in light of this, we thought one of the ways that we could try to address these large uncertainties, and when you think 20 years in the future, there are tremendous uncertainties because there are a lot more variables than those three that I just talked about: land use, population, and climate change, certainly. So we came up with 4 scenarios, and these are really caricatures of, not that any one of these is going to happen, probably some combination of all of them are going to happen. But we tried to think about these tipping points or breaking points or thresholds around which the system would then reorganize. And one is certainly the dry well scenario, right? Rainfall continues to decrease, evaporation continues to increase. There's less and less available water even during the wet season. So what do you do in that sort of case? Well, you start looking for alternative water sources, right? Things like interbasin transfers, ways of increasing the storage that you have that's not vulnerable to the tax of evaporation. One of the things we sort of touched on in this scenario is whether or not there needs to be new ways of thinking about water law. The water management districts were set up around some ideas put forth by University of Florida Professor Maloney in the late 60s, early 70s about reasonable and beneficial use. But there's been a lot of discourse since then about, is that the best way to deal with these issues of water allocation, especially under a declining water availability. And then the other thing we thought about is this idea about changing the scale of governance of water. Right now they're sort of set up around basins with these appointed boards. And so the question is, and I see this a lot in resource delivery systems, electrical systems, ones that are set up to designed to deliver these sorts of things, about a scaling down, all right? In which more and more of the responsibility and the management for these systems is happening at smaller scales. So instead of a basin-wide authority, you're adding to that, sub-basin and even neighborhood and local kinds of authorities, right? And that involves cities, who are one of the major users. One of the other ones we looked at is the sort of techno fix, right? We called it turning black gold into blue gold. So you can supplement or do away with the work that nature does. I try to impress on my students how much energy it takes to evaporate a little bit of water, transport it a number of miles, and then deposit it nice and clean in a place. Well, you can do that, right, through technology, RO, other sorts of filtration treatments as well. But it costs a lot of energy. So instead of paying cents per gallon, you're paying, or fractions of cents per gallon, you're paying, dollars per gallon. Of course, A lot of people pay $8 a gallon to get bottled water anyway, but you know, and which is okay for small amounts of consumption, but for wide applications, you know, it's an expensive proposition. And there's lots and lots of experience from this from the west coast of Florida. About folks who, the Southwest Florida Water Management District has really tried this. One of the other things that a lot of resource folks around the country are arguing is the use of markets in allocating water rather than using government-based rules. Let markets determine that distribution, that allocation, based on willingness to pay, right? But this is kind of the technological future that a lot of people are thinking about. But the other side of this is that especially when it starts to think 20 to 40 years into the future, lots and lots of scientists are saying that we're approaching this period of the end of cheap oil, right? And oil is one of the drivers, or can be one of the energy sources. It doesn't have to be. You can use hydropower or solar to drive these kinds of plants. But folks, a lot of scientists are saying that, you know, we're approaching that peak in terms of there will still be oil available, but it's going to get a lot more expensive. The third scenario that we came up with is kind of the doom and gloom, I guess you could call this the kind of Katrina scenario, right? Where there are rising sea levels, there's some work coming out now, some scholarship that hurricanes are getting stronger because of heating seawaters, so that the frequency and intensity is likely to increase. More and more variation, and essentially people leave Florida, and the government support systems that folks relied upon to recover after these hurricanes are bankrupt. They're gone. They can't afford to help people recover after these tremendous shocks to the system. And then the last one we came up is kind of the green landing, right? That folks are able to figure out what this thing called sustainability means and actually implement it. Ecosystem restoration has been successful. There's lots and lots of integration across land uses where folks are not fighting about water but helping each other out. Again, this sort of cross-scale management that goes on, so it's not just a water management district operating at a regional scale, but it really goes from the household. There's more and more responsibility for managing and using that water. People have been able to figure out ways to get demands or use down to the order of 30 to 40 gallons per person per day, so, which is a fifth of about what they are now. So. And a lot of that is done through reuse and recycling kinds of approaches to this. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, we came up with three general conclusions. I mean, there's no specific, you know, you need to go pass a law to do this, but it's not going to be like our world. It's going to be a very different future. There'll be a lot more surprises, a lot more variability. I think we need to start thinking about a much more dynamic way of planning and adapting to change that's going to happen. I think the best thing that people can do right now is to, and I am a huge advocate of groups like foundations, because I think they are the leaders in this area. I think government has sort of given up its role as leading change, and I think that really the change agents are in groups like this foundation. It's to stimulate lots and lots of experiments, right? All these kind of wild things that could happen at local scales, that could happen at neighborhood scales, that could happen at sub-regional scales. So that really the challenge is, how do you foster that individual and collective creativity for people to start solving these problems? Some of it's going to be increased efficiency of use. Some of it's going to be thinking more about it, you know, in decisions that they make. And finally, the last one is, you know, in times like this, when there's lots and lots of great uncertainties, I think the best thing you can do is to innovate. Think about new ways of doing business outside the box. And I think it's time to start a serious dialogue about whether or not we really need new kinds of governance and management institutions for dealing with water.
Okay, so two take-home messages from the report that we highlighted. The first message is to loosen the creative potential of people who live in this area and are affected by these issues of water supply, water quality. And I think that the groups like the Community Foundation can play a key role in fostering that imagination, fostering that creativity, and trying to develop new ways of solving old problems. We're now in the 21st century, and yet we're still applying 20th century ideas and technology to solve these problems. So the first thing is to innovate and create. The second recommendation is to experiment. That is, we're not going to know what of these solutions are going to work until we try them. So for example, if one were to set up a goal of trying to achieve a residential use rate of 30 gallons per person per day, could you do it? And the only way you're going to find out is to try it. That is, what would be an opportunity to structure a house in which people could conserve and reuse and recycle water to achieve those kinds of rates.